Good afternoon, everybody. Buenas tardes. Welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. It's nice to have everybody here for today's discussion. No news is not good news. Combating pervasive violence against journalists in Mexico. We're very happy to welcome 4 stellar panelists who will be introduced momentarily. And we're also very happy to partner in this event with our good friends at Reporters Without Borders. Today's discussion will be moderated by Michael Camilleri. Many of you know, directs the Dialogue's Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program. The program has a keen interest in freedom of expression issues in the hemisphere, reflected in an annual conference called Medios y Democracia in the spring, and also a recently released report on online disinformation in the United States and its implications for Latin America. Today's important conversation on the urgent challenges of violence against journalists in Mexico is a continuation of this work, which benefits from collaboration of many partners in Washington and throughout the region, including Reporteros Sin Fronteras. On this note, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sabine Dolan, Interim Executive Director of Reporters Without Borders, to provide some opening remarks and also introduce our speakers. Welcome to all again. Sabine. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for being here. It's really nice to see everybody. I'm always tempted to ask people to come towards the front seat, the front row, which is empty, but we'll see. So historically, countries at war are the most dangerous for the press. Mexico is not at war, yet with at least 6 journalists killed in the last, killed in just 7 months, it is the most dangerous country to be a reporter in the world in 2019. Journalists who cover sensitive political stories, who cover organized crime, are warned, they are threatened, and often gunned down. Collusion between officials and organized crime poses a grave threat to journalists' safety. It also cripples the judicial system at all levels. Generally speaking, impunity rules the day. In March, an international delegation of Reporters Without Borders went to Mexico to raise some of these issues with the government. We also submitted a formal request to the International Criminal Court to investigate these crimes of violence against journalists that took place during the terms of Mexico's 2 preceding presidents, Felipe Calderón and Enrique Peña Nieto. Prepared jointly with our Mexican partner Propuesta Cívica, the request identifies 116 crimes against journalists related to their work, 102 murders, and 14 enforced disappearances. Will this help? We do not know, but so far we did not get any concrete answers from President AMLO. So how are we, as members of the press and advocates, to address this violence against journalists? How are we to handle the judicial system that utterly fails at journalist protection, even when a protection mechanism is already in place? And what to do when almost 99% of crimes against journalists remain unsolved? Well, this panel hopes to gain a better understanding of what paths are open to Mexican journalists and partners in advocacy to combat this spiral of violence. With us today, we're really happy to have Maureen Meyer, Director of the Mexico Program at the Washington Office on Latin America, Alejandra Ibarra-Chaul, journalist, founder, and lead at Democracy Fighters, Dola Esteves, weekly columnist at sinembargo.com and freelance journalist, Edison Lanza, Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And as Michael mentioned, we have Michael Camilleri, Director of the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law program at the Inter-American Dialogue, who will be moderating this panel. Thank you all for being here, and up to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sabine. Really wonderful to partner with RSF on this discussion. I think you've framed for us very well the context for this conversation and really the urgency that drove us to convene the conversation. So I want to again welcome our panelists. We're really privileged to have you all here. We're very much looking forward to hearing, I think, both the perspectives of two Mexican journalists, Alejandra and Dolia, as well as Edison and Maureen, who have done a lot of work in Mexico, thinking about issues of protection and prosecution of crimes against journalists. So really, I think, a very well-rounded set of speakers. I'm going to ask each of them to kick us off with a few minutes of remarks, and then we'll open a conversation, and we'll leave time for all of your questions. So I'd like to just start maybe with you, Dolia. You're the lucky one. You've been reporting on issues of politics and organized crime and corruption in Mexico for a long time, and maybe you could tell us a bit about your perception of the situation facing Mexican journalists today, and maybe in perspective how it compares to prior years in which you were doing this work and your colleagues were doing this important work.
Yes, I want to start by thanking everybody here for, being here despite the heat outside. I think that's contributed to not filling up the room. And I want to thank Michael and the and Reporters Without Borders for sponsoring this conference. I've been participating in this type of conference too many years. And it's quite frustrating. I think my first conference was in 2006 in El Paso, and things have not improved. I can say that they have gotten worse. Mexico is indeed a country where journalists are murdered with absolute impunity, and it has long been the deadliest country for journalism in the Western Hemisphere. There's a cycle of violence and impunity. Impunity is for crimes against journalists 99.6%. And we can easily say there's a crisis situation with potential of getting worse. My count is 7 journalists have been killed since AMLO took power in December 1st. And I will name their names because it's important to know who they are, because I don't want them to just be another statistic. I just don't want them to be 7 so far. So it's Francisco Romero, Jesus Ramos, Omar Camacho, Rafael Murúa, Santiago Barroso, Santiago Enriquez, y Norma Saravina. She's the only female, and she was killed June 11. We haven't had a killing for over a month, which is, I guess, good news under these circumstances. And she was killed in front of her house in the state of Tabasco, which is Tabasco is the state of the president. So where are the threats coming from? NGOs have published extensively where the threats coming from. I'm just going to say that although organized crime groups have borne the brunt of blame for violence against journalists, a large share of the blame also lies with corrupt governments, government officials at 3 levels: municipal, state, and federal level. And the attacks since 2010 have expanded. It used to be concentrated, geographically speaking, only in the states where organized crime was more, the presence of organized crime was stronger, but now it's spreading to places that we didn't have the problem before, like Baja California Sur, San Luis Potosí, Guanajuato, Quintana Roo, Chihuahua, and Veracruz, who is considered the most dangerous of all the states. And the other question that you asked me to answer is, have things improved in the past 7 months under President López Obrador? And I'm sorry to say, but things have not improved. Mexican authorities appear to be unable to stem violence, not only against journalists, but in general. If the current trend does not reverse, 2019, that is this year, could end up being the most lethal year, superseding the worst years so far, which were 2018 and 2010, in which each year 10 journalists were killed. We're talking about 7 so far, and it's only the middle of July. To be fair, AMLO administration has only been in office 7 months, but there are reasons to be concerned. And I will just mention 2, so I don't want to go over my 5 minutes here. I probably already did, but anyway. The president's hostile rhetoric against critical media, which he calls FIFI. That's basically something that we can't translate into English, but the meaning is elitist or out of touch, and or conservative. He calls them that way. And this rhetoric against the journalist or the prensa fifí, I guess not all of them, is creating an environment that obviously makes it easier to attack journalists and exposes journalists in very much the way, and I don't want to compare AMLO and Trump, but very much the way Trump has labeled journalism in the United States enemies of the state. So you have seen Jim Acosta from CNN being attacked and so forth. So it's not good that the president of a country attacks and targets journalists. If he's unhappy with their coverage, there are other ways to settle or to talk or to dialogue. And the second thing, which I think some of my colleagues here will talk, is the weakness of the institutions that were created expressly to protect journalists and investigate crimes against the press. And the mechanism for the defense and protection of journalists, it's not working, has never worked, and now we have a problem, which is the budget cuts across the board. So just to conclude, I want to show you a picture here, which you probably all know. And the reason I want to conclude with this picture, just hold it for me, is that this picture, which became iconic in the immigration crisis we are living and we see every day, was taken by Julia Leduc, who is a photojournalist in Tamaulipas. And Tamaulipas is one of the most dangerous places in the world. And this tells us that despite violence and lack of protection, journalists in Mexico continue risking their lives to produce high quality and high impact journalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Dolia. That was really excellent. We're going to come back to a lot of the issues that you raised, but let me pick up on one, which is you name the names of the journalists who've been killed this year, and I think you're right that as staggering and alarming as the numbers are, sometimes there's a risk that we sort of lose sight when we talk about the numbers of the human lives and the human impact that lies behind those numbers. So I want to turn to Alejandra so she can tell us about the Democracy Fighters Project, which aims really to revive and continue and contextualize the work and the legacy of about 100 journalists, I think, who have been killed since 2000. So maybe you can tell us a little about the project and what inspired it and what you've learned in working on it.
Of course. Well, thank you to the dialogue and to RSF for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And thanks all of you for coming. I think exactly that's a perfect segue to talk about my project. I lead a project called Democracy Fighters, which is an archive that aggregates the works of the journalists killed in Mexico. I'd like to tell you a bit of how this idea came about and what we found. So I was reporting on the immigration beat, actually, when I came across this idea. And my former boss and I came across the story of a journalist from Chihuahua who had fled Mexico due to threats. The military was threatening him, so he came to the US, where he stayed successfully for 10 years until Trump got elected, and then he went for a regular check-in with immigration and was placed in deportation proceedings. That's how we found out about his story. And while reporting on his story, I was looking for his reporting, for those clips and for those publications which put him in risk. And funnily enough, I could never find them. So I started wondering, if he's still alive and I cannot find his work, what about the works of all of those journalists who have actually been killed? So I started doing research, and there is no place that currently aggregates these places and preserves them, which is worrying enough, I think. But then, while digging more, I realized that some of these clips and publications are quickly disappearing, especially the ones on online outlets where the domains have gone up for sale, or on social media where videos, audio, and texts are quickly vanishing. So I started calling together this archive with the support of the Brown Institute for Media Innovation at Columbia. And then I realized that if you got to the clips and you read the journalists' works, but you sort of read them in a void, it wouldn't tell you that much about them, about their work, about the risks they faced. So Democracy Fighters is an archive that aggregates the works of journalists while providing context of the places where they worked. This is meant for three main publics: for the general public who's not aware of this crisis, so they can go into the website, explore, navigate, and learn about this; for academics who want to further the understanding of what's happening in Mexico; for journalists; and for advocacy workers. Now, the main motivation behind this project is precisely the same motivation that Dolia mentioned when she called out the names. That a lot of these journalists have become ciphers or numbers or statistics. And I think it's really unfair that they are remembered because they were killed. And we see people's legacies all over the place all the time. We see an architect's legacies in the buildings she built. We see professors' legacies living on through their students, or an attorney's legacies that live on through the cases he fought. Journalists' legacies should not be their deaths. Their legacies should be their works. And that's why we're aggregating them, preserving them, and making sure they're still read, listened to, and viewed. So that's basically it.
Thank you, Alejandra. Edison, you've been, I think, to Mexico a few times, but specifically, I think in late 2017, you were there with David Kaye, the UN rapporteur, actually following up on a visit that several years before, Frank LaRue, when he was UN Special Rapporteur, and your predecessor, Catalina Botero, made to Mexico to examine the state of freedom of expression there. You looked closely at a number of issues, among them the issues that Dolia mentioned, the protection mechanism, the Special Prosecutor's Office. But maybe you could just take us through some of the key findings from your visit and the subsequent report, and your evaluation of the situation of violence against journalists in Mexico and what's being done to address it.
Thank you. And my English is so well. My apologies. Thank you, Michael, and for the dialogue and also the Reporter Without Borders for keep the attention in the Mexico situation. Yes, I want to raise some numbers that you mentioned that, but in the period of 10 years, we have a promise like 10 to 12 journalists lost their lives. and this might remain constant in Mexico, no? I think that the both visits, the first visit that did Frank and Catalina, and the last visit in 2017, we focus in what is the the work that and the advisor that the international body could do to improve the situation. The first visit is focused in building some institution to address this crisis, this terrible and catastrophic crisis of violence against journalists. Of course, in the context of a general crisis of violence, but the special rapporteur talked that this crisis against journalists, violence against journalists, need a special and differential answer for the states and through some building some institution. The first visit recommend that first of all construct and building a special mechanism of protection to journalists and human rights defenders, a special prosecutor body to conduct the investigation and fight against the impunity in these cases, and third, some other reforms about the relationship between the states and the media, because Mexico also is in a long transition between the authoritarianism previous governments and a democracy that with a better quality. And both reports address also institutions like access to information, the management of the public advertising, the management of the frequency and the diversity and the necessity of more diversity and pluralism in the media, because all this context is also part of the situation in Mexico. Say 6 or 7 years after that, in the middle of the Peña Nieto government, with the special report of UN, we raised our concern about the loss of interest of the government of Peña Nieto and the previous one to reinforce and strengthen this mechanism, and we did before the visit some actions with in share with the civil society, like some press release, other visits, and denounce the situation. Finally, a couple of, I think, 6 months before our visit, the Peña Nieto government changed some function, some authorities in the mechanism and also in the special prosecutor, and very slow but improved the protection and the situation of the impunity. But when we conduct the visit, finally we have an interview with all in 5 states, with the journalists, victims, civil society organization, authorities, and so on. And our focus, our idea is to do some very specific recommendations to improve those mechanisms. I left there, and now we could share all the report, and in each chapter, protection, impunity, prevention, we did very specific recommendation. First of all, funding the mechanism, improve the qualification of the official that did the risk reports, follow the measures, have a special, a gender perspective in both in the mechanism and also the prosecutor. Remain or maintain the FEADLE is like the special prosecutor of crimes against journalists. Made a protocol to prosecute the cases that involves freedom of expression, because they didn't have a special protocol for this kind of crimes, or a line of 10 or 12 recommendation in each chapter. The government accept this recommendation. The previous government accepted this recommendation, but now become the new government. And then, in these 7 months, we don't have a strong answer, a strong response about this crisis. First of all, because that you mentioned the rhetoric and the narrative of the government, leading by the AMLO, by the president, against some journalists and some press that they talk like a fifi press and privileged press and so on. And in the other hand, because the new government, have a rhetoric and also a practice to, I don't know in English, what do you say, austeridad or cut funding or cut spending a budget in different areas. And also in this area, they are reluctant to invest more money and more resources. And this is, I think that the mechanism, the federal mechanisms have now some confidence by the journalists, but the mechanism needs more funding and more investment and more, focus to improve the situation. Now the government in the last 2 months started a conversation with the UN and our office to have a diagnostic of the situation of the mechanism. This morning I talked about that with the UN Human Rights Office in Mexico, and they tell me that perhaps in the final of this month they announce rebuilding the mechanism of the mechanism of to protect journalists. This is a good news, but in my field it's so slow in relation with the crisis that still remains, because this year the data of the crisis of violence still remains no change in the last 6 or 7 months. This is one issue. In the other hand, the prosecutor system in Mexico, it's under discussion now, because the civil society asked to the politicians, to the government, to change and to improve the independence and the autonomous of the whole of the Fiscalía General, because all understand that one of the problems in the justice system in Mexico it's the lack of independence of the general prosecutor. In this context, the change of the improve of strain the situation of the FEADLE, it remains without change, because the government is still waiting to a general approach first, and then to come to what happened with the human rights prosecutor, and in this context, the unit of the fighting against the prosecutor about freedom of expression. This is the framework at today.
Terrific. Thank you, Edison. I think that's a great segue to Maureen. Maureen, you recently published a report called Turning the Tide on Impunity, Protection and Access to Justice for Journalists and Human Rights Defenders in Mexico. Looked at a lot of these same issues. Edison has mentioned the Fiscalía reform. He's mentioned the potential revamping of the protection mechanism. Maybe you can walk us through what you found is working, and maybe more importantly, what's not working in these areas, and point us towards what would need to be improved.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks to Dialogue and Reporters Without Borders for sponsoring this important discussion on a really key issue in Mexico, given the high levels of killings, I would say, both of journalists and human rights defenders. At least 11 defenders have been murdered this year as well. So I think it's a equally concerning situation. The report we did was follow-up to at least 2 reports and memos we've done in the past that particularly focused on the mechanism to protect human rights defenders and journalists that was established in 2012. I think overall, the idea was what is or isn't working with the mechanism, but as compared to previous reports, we also looked at the biggest issue, which is a mechanism at best is a Band-Aid to the bigger problem, which is until cases of attacks against journalists are investigated and those responsible are prosecuted, they're going to keep happening. And so the other area was not just let's look at what's working with protection or not. It's, as you know, what Edison just highlighted, what is or isn't working with prosecution or investigating these cases. Not to kind of maybe complement what's been said before, I think what we found with the mechanism itself is it's better than it was certainly a few years ago in terms of consolidation of a team, of having the different units in place. The bigger challenges are much more on the resources that the mechanism has and broader concerns. One, I think, on risk protocols, so risk assessment of defenders and journalists at risk. I think the biggest challenge is still looking at how do you assess risks for rural defenders or journalists, indigenous people, women who have a different set of needs oftentimes in terms of protection, because it's not just themselves, but also their families that are threatened. And also, where do you do with journalists, for example, whose livelihood is covering a local beat in a state like Guerrero, who removing them from that state temporarily isn't necessarily a good option because they lose their livelihood. So there's really, I think, those still challenges of protecting people who are either in very remote parts of the country, which is also seen, but also where, how do you maintain someone's livelihood if what they're working on is so much based on where they usually are and where they're working? So I think those, broader challenges. One positive thing we have seen is, at least in the state of Chihuahua, there has been more progress made on what's called a contingency plan. So where, based on requests by civil society organizations in Chihuahua, really pushing to develop a plan that sort of tries to prevent further attacks from happening. And I think both the UN and the Commission have highlighted that if this is done well in Chihuahua, it's sort of a work in progress, it could be a better model for looking at prevention. It was also sort of started in Veracruz for journalists, but I think, again, an example of where it wasn't done well because of the lack of political will in Veracruz to really implement anything that might try to prevent further attacks or looking at the root causes of why people, by journalists or defenders, are being attacked. I think the other is the reliable protection mechanisms themselves. You're right, there's a whole assessment of the mechanism itself and what measures should be in place. Since we issued our report from the time of August 2017 to March of this year, which is when our report came out, 6 beneficiaries of the mechanism were killed in Mexico. Since then, another journalist who was under the protection mechanism was also killed. There's been 2 journalists this year that were killed that were beneficiaries. So certainly suggesting it's not enough and what's in place isn't working to effectively protect people. And so we certainly view very positive the intention of revamping completely the mechanism or what type of protection measures are being provided. The biggest challenge is resources. So as you've all mentioned, the Undersecretary for Human Rights and Migration, Alejandro Encinas, at the Ministry of Interior, saw his budget cut pretty dramatically this year. The budget for protection by mechanisms themselves, like a separate budget that is given by the Mexican Congress, was about a little bit under $3 million less than last year. Even knowing how much they spent on the mechanism to protect people last year, they gave them $3 million less. There are no new staff. So right now, you could see as a success the fact that more people are going to the mechanism for protection because they have more trust in it. I mean, you can think about it that way, of like more journalists and defenders believe that this could be a valid way to get protection. But right now, we had, at least in March, 831 people being beneficiaries of the protection measure with only 35 staff to oversee all of the mechanism itself. That hasn't changed. The staff hasn't changed in a few years. So you have more and more beneficiaries with the same number of staff trying to cover them. And so that puts at risk the type of regular assessments of, how much at risk people are, also follow up to cases, or how quickly you can actually resolve requests for protection. Going on briefly to the investigation side, and this I recognize my colleague Gina Hinojosa, who did a lot of the research for this part. What we wanted to do was look at, based on freedom of information requests to both the federal government, and then we picked the 10 states where there's been more beneficiaries to the protection measure, protection mechanism to look at what's happened with investigations of cases. And I think what we found overall is it's really hard to assess anything given the real lack of data that you get from the Mexican government, including states like the state of Mexico that does not record as a specific crime, crimes against journalists or human rights defenders, other states looking at their data versus data, that Reporters Without Borders or CPJ or Mexican organizations have compiled about attacks doesn't add up. So undercounting what we believe in a lot of states of a crime against a journalist that may just be listed as a common crime versus actually a crime that's related perhaps to that person's profession. So the real concern, if you don't at least look at that aspect of it, are you missing something about the motive of that crime? We overall of the states that we examined, and these were requests for progress or the results of investigations from 2012 to June 2018, we found that only 3% of state level investigations had actually gone to court. So a very low level of a prosecution or even knowing what happens with the case. That was the other. Certain states don't keep track of their cases, so they don't know and can't report on the results of their prosecution in terms of convictions. On the federal level with the special prosecutor for crimes against freedom of expression, we found that less than 12% of their cases had been taken to court, and only 5 cases had resulted in a conviction. We should flag that part of this was data before or during the time when there was a different prosecutor. So the current prosecutor, Ricardo Sanchez del Pozo, has done, it seems, more work on prosecution of cases. There had been 5 other convictions, not homicides or grave cases, but other convictions during his term, and seeing, where that goes in the future. But I think the bigger challenge is, as you had, one, how do you implement these protocols to investigate crimes against freedom of expression, particularly at the state level? I mean, the prosecutor, Fiadle Sanchez, had said to us, it's not even necessarily you need to have a special prosecutor at a state for crimes against freedom of expression. What you need are people that actually know how to investigate these crimes. And so having protocols or having better training on how to investigate crimes against journalists would be more important than just having an office that you can say is a special prosecutor focused on these crimes. And the bigger issue for the federal government is the budget. So again, going back to this, but I think it's really important, and it's something that the commission had highlighted in their report, is even if they want to do a really good job on cases, they don't have the resources to do it. Fiadle's budget has fallen 54% between 2014 and 2018. So you actually have an office that is likely taking on more cases with less resources to do it. We have seen in certain cases too where they're not always exercising the power that they have to attract cases from the states when it's clear that the states haven't done a good investigation. So this is something that Fiadle can do. In the case, for example, of Miroslava Bric, who was killed in Chihuahua, it took the family and organizations litigating 2 years to actually force Fiadle to take on the case completely from the state government. So a lot of questions on when they actually do exercise this power, but also how do you get them the resources they might need to really investigate more cases more effectively. And then lastly, I think what Edison just commented on, the fact that now under the new Fiscalía General, so this new autonomous national prosecutor's office, these crimes will be investigated under the special prosecutor for human rights, who has not been named. They issued a few days ago the decree kind of creating the office, but it's not clear who that person will be. We would hope that a lot of the lessons learned and highlighted in all these different reports are fed into whoever is going to be both at the special prosecutor, but also in these special offices that would likely be investigating crimes against journalists, human rights defenders, and all the other larger human rights concerns we have in Mexico on disappearances, torture, etc. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Maureen. Dolia, you touched on a lot of those issues. You spoke about both the government's need to sort of commit to these mechanisms and fund them and support them, but also these issues of sort of rhetoric and legitimizing the work of journalists. Of course, some of these issues go back to previous governments, and there was even a case of illegal surveillance, the Pegasus incident under the Peña Nieto administration. So there have been concerns, I think, going back some time about the way that administrations in Mexico relate to relate to the press. From your standpoint and that of your colleagues, what would a strong commitment from the administration look like? What would you like to see if you had President López Obrador here in front of you and he said, I really want to own this issue. I want to, put my government on the right side of defending press freedom and showing that we're committed to journalist safety. What would that look like in your mind?
Well, thank you. I think, is this on? Yeah. I think one of the things is a commitment and political will, which so far we haven't seen in the president. There was a major summit of journalists organized by the Committee to Protect Journalists in Mexico City in the Museo de Antropología. There were 400 people there. And the organizers went out of their way to have AMLO there. And he didn't answer, or his people didn't answer. And the next day, he referred to the conference or to the panel saying, well, they attacked me in these panels the next day in his morning briefing. He didn't mention the CPJ, but he said there was even a panel in which I was criticized or something. So obviously, some of the things that have been said here, the strengthening of the mechanism, it's one thing that he can certainly do. The second thing is making a priority out of investigations and prosecution of people, because as long as we have over 99% impunity, no mechanism is going to work. I mean, for me, the mechanism is a last resort. If you don't have laws that are enforced, if you don't have a state of law, then the mechanism, there's a reason why a lot of the 6 reporters under the mechanism have been killed. So it has to be more fundamental, the change. And the other thing is the reform of advertising, government advertising, and that's just a huge discussion, which we can't even start going through here. And what you mentioned, the end of surveillance of reporters, and the wife of Javier Valdez was also spied as recently as last year. So those are things that obviously the government AMLO can start with. The other thing is, I don't want to be unfair. In this conference, we had Alejandro Encinas, and he was very receptive. And he did admit it, which I consider this a breakthrough, that that impunity lies with the government, and he did say, and he did talk about the need of reforming and strengthening the mechanism, and following the recommendations of the UN. So he was genuinely concerned with the problem, and I think that there are a lot of people in the government concerned with the problem that understand what it means not to have a free press, and not to be able to report. Like in many states in Mexico, journalists cannot report certain issues because next day they're dead. And that's, you can't have a democracy like they want to have in Mexico, or the government wants to have, without a free press. But there's mixed messages coming. AMLO every day in his morning briefing attacking certain critical reporters or media. And on the other hand, people like Encinas and other people in the government truly concerned that this thing is getting out of hand.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Edison has a report called Zonas Silenciadas, which came to mind when you talked about the areas where information really can't circulate because the situation is so grave. Alejandra, the word impunity comes up a lot, and I want to ask you about it from maybe a more personal angle in terms of you're dealing in some of the work you're doing for the archive with the families, with the colleagues, the employers of some of the journalists who have been killed, and obviously killing a journalist is aimed at silencing that journalist, but also silencing others, right? It's the sort of chilling effect that is both the objective of the crime and also why it has a broader significance and it's so corrosive for society at large. So maybe you could just speak to that in terms of your engagement with the those who surrounded these journalists who were killed, and specifically to the impact that impunity has. When these crimes go unsolved, how does that impact the willingness, the ability of their fellow journalists to go about doing the job that they're paid to do?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that the effect of impunity is despair amongst journalists because they know that the crimes won't be solved. So it's sort of disappointing to keep doing it, knowing that there won't be justice. But that's part of the aim of democracy fighters. Specifically because the aim in killing or committing violent attacks against journalists is to silence them, we hope to make those crimes costlier. Because if the intent is to erase that information or to have that not be public or forgotten, we want to make sure that doesn't happen. We want to make sure that prevails, that stays there, and people keep reading it and keep consuming it. So on that front, we want to make murders costlier, but we also think that having the material there helps or could help solve the crimes. During the anniversary of the death of Javier Valdez in Culiacán, Prosecutor Sanchez del Pozo was present, which I think is a positive thing that he was there and that he was presenting the investigation that they're going through. But he mentioned that they had read through all of Javier's work in order to see what lines of investigations they could draw from it. And apparently they drew 125 investigation possibilities from his work. So that's one journalist. If we are able to have the works of 106 in the archive available for the prosecutors to read and analyze, I think that can also help combat impunity.
Edison, what's your evaluation of the special prosecutor's office? Because there is a sense, and I think Maureen mentioned this, that for a long time it was, constantly kind of every couple of years the special prosecutor would change, and it would be sort of would feel like a new beginning, but nothing really seemed to change in terms of its ability to actually prosecute cases. But lately, there's the word on the street seems to be that perhaps there's a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel, that some convictions, at least in some of the simpler cases, are being achieved. Do you think that that a corner has been turned, or are you still worried that because of some of these resources issues or the restructuring or tendencies to eliminate logical lines of inquiry that there's still work to do in terms of really making that the robust office that it could be?
Yes, I think the change of the last prosecutor, the currently prosecutor, is a demonstration that if the government have a will to improve the prosecution against the crimes against journalists, it's possible even in the difficult context of Mexico, because Ricardo Sanchez did a better work in relation with the previous appointment, the previous prosecutors, and simple with redirect some resources that the office has, better capacity building with the other prosecutors that work together with him. The idea that the prosecutor need to move for the states to conduct the research and the investigation in the field, with the state prosecutors. One of the measures that we recommend is have a transparent rules to attract case to the federal field, because Mexico have another problem between the corruption and the collusion in the state level in some states, and these reflect in the investigation of the cases. And I think that only just 3 or 4 cases among these 80 or 90 cases was attracted for the federal level, and this prosecutor start to improve the situation, but we need a decisive measure to transparent the rules to attract cases. In the other hand, I'm very concerned, and we are concerned with the special rapporteur of UN in regard cases that the state are involved. For example, the case of Pegasus and the spyware, because in this case, the general prosecutor buy this software to this espionage against surveillance against journalists, against human rights defenders, against the victims. And in this report, we recommend that in this special case, it's a very important signal for the actual government to appointment an independent and special mechanism to conduct this investigation. And this is will be a very strong signal that this government want to change the practice that the government before. Because if you don't have result about this investigation, surveillance conducted by the state, you don't change, it's impossible to change the authorization mechanism against the human rights defender and journalists. And until now, the government, perhaps Encina say in some case to the civil society that they allow a special mechanism, but until now the government not made steps to conduct and to appointment independent investigation or an international mechanism, to clean this situation about the surveillance.
Great. Alejandro, let me just come back to you on that, because I wonder, in compiling the stories of these journalists, if you've noticed patterns. Are there specific types of stories or issues that tended to place journalists in particular danger that would be logical things, as you suggested, for prosecutors then to be looking into in terms of lines of inquiry for the investigations?
Yeah, there's definitely patterns that we've seen so far. Thinking about the kind of outlets, for example, it's mainly local outlets. There's few cases where the journalists were correspondents for national outlets. It's mostly online outlets, which also speaks, I think, to the fact that part of this is the conditions under which journalists are working. And in terms of beats, there's a lot of crime police beat, which in Mexico we would call nota roja. And this is particularly interesting because in some cases, reporters started covering either suicides, petty crime, just like small events of police-involved success, like events. But then they started covering organized crime. When that beat became organized crime, as their regions became more and more violent, the beat ends up being sort of security, but it wasn't at the beginning. There's also a lot of political coverage and human rights. And another thing that we've noticed, which is also interesting, I think, is there's some reporters whose job as journalistic investigations seems to be the cause of their murders, but there's some in which it almost seems that it's freedom of expression in a larger scale. There's cases where journalists were doing reporting for years, and then the moment they started being very critical of the government on their social media, on their individual personal social media, the attacks started happening. So it is because they were reporters, but it's also a larger theme and problem about freedom of expression.
Marine, we're in Washington, so I'm going to ask you about U.S. foreign policy, which is mentioned in the report. Actually, in a positive way, you discussed the support that the United States has provided for the protection mechanism. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that and whether that support has been sustained and how it can be best leveraged. But also, I'd like to ask you about something that Dolia raised, which was this issue of rhetoric and some parallels in the way that President Trump and President López Obrador speak about the press and to what extent you think that matters coming out of the city.
Actually, want to quickly comment on one other issue that you had raised previously, which is, you had asked about what López Obrador could do on freedom of expression. And I want to just highlight the fact that this is also a very state level problem in Mexico too, and that a lot of attacks against journalists happen by local governments and local politicians or other groups. And I think we need to keep that attention on the fact that in even like murder cases, so Moises Sanchez, who was murdered in Veracruz, it's believed one of the mayor of the town may have been, part of the order to kill him. That still is under investigation. But I think not losing fact that local and state governments also have a really strong role to play in protecting freedom of expression, both in terms of investigations. I would agree there needs to be more clarity in terms of when the federal government should take on an investigation, but I think that primary responsibility oftentimes falls with the states, who are oftentimes not doing their job. In part of the research we had done, had asked also about how many investigations are against journalists and human rights defenders, and found, at least in the state of Chihuahua, it's not clear the reasons, but there were almost twice as many investigations against journalists and human rights defenders for to be like alleged aggressors of crimes than there were of crimes against them. And I think that criminalization of journalists happens a lot also at the state level, and we need to balance. Yes, the federal government is the one that puts the priorities down, and certainly in the funding, also looking at how they fund states, but let's also focus on the local governments and state governments and their own responsibility, so that they can't like wash their hands and say it's all the federal government's responsibility to be looking at, protecting freedom of expression and journalists in Mexico. To your questions, the United States has supported since the beginning the mechanism to protect human rights defenders and journalists, mostly for several years through Freedom House. Maria Clara Costa, who was the director of Freedom House, is actually up here this week with us for other meetings on the rule of law in Mexico, but did a lot to do technical assistance, a lot looking at Colombia's experience that the U.S. also had supported to look at protection measures in Colombia. So assistance on risk analysis protocols, getting a lot of what needs to be put in place to have a functioning mechanism, at least in terms of standards and procedures. Obviously, the other challenge is turnover and staff training, but did, I think, a lot on that. USAID has also funded a lot of civil society organizations, Article 19 and others, to monitor and document crimes against freedom of expression in Mexico, as well as supporting journalists at risk. We have seen two other kind of brief things. One, they had allocated $1 million in support for FIADLE about 2 years ago. So looking at how do you provide technical support for investigations. I think it helped to develop the protocol, the standardized protocol for investigating freedom of expression. They are supporting on human rights defenders through Provoces, which is an organization that sort of USAID has created, to also provide technical assistance to develop a protocol for investigating crimes against human rights defenders, which does not exist, as well as broader technical assistance to Mexican agencies that are looking at corruption and violence against journalists and human rights defenders. We think it's important support that should continue. I think particularly as we look at budget gaps within the Mexican government and Alejandro Encinas as the undersecretary's real desire to rework the mechanism where you might need to draw on further assistance, whether that's technical assistance or support to civil society efforts in Mexico. We believe that that is an important role that the U.S. government can play in terms of funding and foreign assistance. On the flip side, I think your question on the parallels between, the way that Trump criminalizes reporters and criticizes the press and all the comments on fake news, in a sense, have also complicated the authority the U.S. could actually have on raising concerns of attacks against journalists in Mexico. I think Former Ambassador Roberta Jacobson was really strong in working to protect journalists in Mexico. She hosted a lot of meetings with journalists in Mexico. She would tweet frequently anytime someone was under attack or being killed. We hope that continues. I think that the broader issue is with administration that does work to discredit the press here. What leverage do they have to raise these concerns with the Mexican government? It's clear, though, that this is an issue for the U.S. Congress. Many members of Congress raised in the nomination hearing for the new ambassador to Mexico from the United States a lot of concerns about attacks against freedom of expression and attacks against social activists, and really wanting to work with the ambassador when his nomination process moves forward. But really, I think there is a lot of concern from members of Congress here, and that I think is important, and we hope would continue, because it is such a key issue in our neighboring country, what's happening with the media, and how do you ensure that they have the space to operate.
I want to open it up here in a second, but maybe, Edison, a final question to you. Maureen mentioned the Colombian experience with a protection mechanism. You obviously work on these issues in the 35 countries of the Americas. Are there experiences, models from other countries that you've seen in places where violence against journalists is an issue that can inform what the Mexicans are doing?
Oh, okay. No, I think that the Colombian experience is the most comprehensive and integral experience of prevent and protect journalists. In fact, if we look into the whole experience, the 20 years of protection of journalists in Colombia, we could show many improve on the situation. In fact, before this year, that because the difficult of the transition of the peace process, and we have a couple of cases of a mix between social human rights defender and journalists. We have a couple of cases of presumed murder of journalists, but in the last 3-4 years, the cases of killing or murder of journalists in Colombia go down very fast, no? And then we have cases of very important journalists in the regions, and also in the national media outlet, that we have protection in 10 years remains the protection, and the state maintained the protection during 10 or 12 years. And I think that Mexico need a state policy about that, and a vision of long term, because this crisis of violence is not go out in a couple of years, because all the things that we mentioned here. And in this regard, I want to raise also a concern about that become a more polarizing, context in social media against journalists. That is very, clearly in this year, and we don't see that before. No, now, because the radicalization between the actual government and the opposition. Now we could see in the social media a narrative, very close than US against journalists. No, in fact, this week, 2 journalists for representative of the national press announced that they received in their houses, harassment and amenazas de muerte. No, then I think that we need to approach this situation very, very quickly, very fast, because it's a very concern.
Great. Thank you, Edison. All right, I think we've got 15 minutes left, so let's open it up and maybe take 3 questions for our panelists, and we'll come back to them. Don't be shy. Yes.
Francisco Alvarez de Guadalajara. 1 comment, 2 questions. Comment is, thank you very much, Maureen, for mentioning that it's not enough to set up this office or commission on human rights or freedom of expression, because at the end of the day, you still need an independent office that knows what to do on the ground and can follow a case through. It's easy to get caught up in formalities. First question is open to anyone on the panel. Do you see any ties between or commonalities between the attacks against journalists and also the attacks against environmental activists on the ground? Although environmental activists on the ground, many of whom are indigenous, might not be formal journalists, they fill a similar role in making a ruckus to bring attention to what they believe are abuses in their community. And then the other question is, we've seen a rise of candidatos independientes who have risen to power across the country, and I'm wondering if you see among them any critical voices that are willing to change the conversation or are actually willing to do something about these abuses against journalists in their new governments. Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Maripaz. I'm from Mexico as well, and I have two questions. So if a lot of the issues have been that the government of Mexico is really not accountable, what are other resources that reporters and journalists can go to that they can actually rely on to remain protected? And the other one is, if there was one thing that could push effectively the government to be accountable and active on this crisis, what would it be? Even if it sounds maybe too good to be true, but if it was one thing that could actually make the government remain accountable, what is your idea of that? Thank you for being here and for sharing your perspective on this.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
I shared in Roma with the Latin America Working Group. My question is specifically for Marine. You talked a little bit about the contingency plans that exist in Chihuahua, and I was just wondering if those were government implemented, civil society, and if you could just talk a little bit more on that.
Terrific. All right. Maybe Dolia, can we start with you and we'll just move down the line?
The question on the connection or similarities of the attacks against journalists and environmentalists, I don't know, maybe Alejandra knows more about that. Journalists in Mexico have been attacked for decades before the environmentalists really existed as they exist now. It's been a problem that goes from the time they killed Buendia, you probably weren't born then, up to the last assassination on June 17th, 11th, this past month. It's a problem of the relationship that the press has had with the government. When the government doesn't like to look bad. So when journalists expose corruption or expose any problems, since there's with government conduct, since there is not much check and balances, the journalists become, or we become, the only ones, or at least one of the strongest voices that calls governments and officials to account. That's the problem, is impunity. And so many cases you can trace back the reason, like the Javier, he was touching, sensitive information of the corruption of the cartels with local governments. So there were a lot of people that wanted to get rid of him, and case by case, you can see that. So obviously, as long as the press does its job of being a watchdog of the institutions and politicians, and if we have a country with a lot of politicians that are corrupt, we're going to have problems, and we're going to have people being silenced in many ways, including assassination. In terms of the question on who else to go, it's international community, the NGOs, blast the NGOs, blast the UN, blast the OAS. I mean, if it wouldn't be for this or these organizations like the Dialogue or the Woodrow Wilson Center that in the past was very, very closely following the violence against journalism, I don't know if things would be worse. I know for a fact that previous governments have stopped doing or have cleaned up their conduct because they know that the UN or they're under the spotlight internationally. So obviously, it's good that there are NGOs, international NGOs, that pay so close attention to this and they advocate for change. The summit last month of the CPJ was a breakthrough. It was the first time we had this kind of response. And governments like Canada that are very, and the United Kingdom too, they are very, I'm not sure about the current government of the United States. It's true what you said, Maureen, about Roberta. She was very, very strong on defending journalists, but it was more like a personal thing. I don't think it was the policy of this administration when you have Trump denying a CIA report about the role of the Saudis in the assassination of Khashoggi, and I'll stop there.
About the environmentalists and that question, I think, as Dolia said, and also as Edison mentioned at the beginning, I think part of this problem in Mexico is a historic problem, right? Where the country has been democratizing, and where do you draw the line when freedom of speech starts growing and when there's more independent journalists between who's a journalist and who isn't a journalist? So I'm not doing that. I'm not making that decision, and that's why I'm not analyzing the works or what the environmentals have said. So I'm not sure that comparison specifically. But that being said, amongst the journalists whose works we are compiling, environmental is maybe like a fourth topic that's most common. And it's specifically like when there's mines, when there's abuses towards minority groups, when there's contamination. So that is also very, very noticeable. And as for new politicians, at a municipal level, I'm not sure. But I recently spoke to the wife of a journalist killed in Veracruz, and she was telling me that the new governor after Duarte, could clearly do a lot of things, right? And she said that the family members of killed journalists were called to a meeting, and he offered, a plaque or some sort of statue or something to remember the killed journalists. And he opened the doors of his office for whatever things they needed and whatnot. So she made an appointment. 6 months later, she hasn't heard anything. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think the whole problem is not only about the life of the journalists, it's also about the public right to know in Mexico and the democracy. The case of Miroslava Bridge is very, illustrate very well the engagement between the organized crime and the local governments, because she was, published some information about, the connection between the politics and the elections and the, candidates, that has, ties with the crime, and she was murdered about this. And in the other hand, I don't know if this government, have a discourse because they tell us the fourth republic or the new republic or to rebuilding the republic, the transformation, in relation with the previous corruption system. Well, if they, protect and have a new policy about many issues of freedom, about freedom of expression and media. I don't know why they conduct a reform of the public, and the democracy, because it's not only about, violence is the world, is the most important problem, but it's not the only problem in Mexico in relation with media and freedom of expression. For example, the relationship between the private sector and the government, Mexico need a reform about the public system of broadcasting, for example. If Mexico become or has a new, or a public system of media, more likely BBC, or this is will be a very, step forward in relation or most diversity and pluralism in the media system, for example. The final relation between the executive branch and the INE, the Institute of Access of Information, that is not clear what is the approach that the new government have about the access of information law. The never finished discussion about advertising, public advertising, that in Mexico it's a biggest amount of money that conduct through the media, and this is a very opaque relationship in the previous government. Mexico needs to address all of these chapter of freedom of expression if Mexico, the democracy and the government, want to comply with a better public sphere. In our side, that we could do in relation with following this situation, it's I was in Mexico 2 or 3 times each year, and in the last months, I have a meeting with some official of the new government, and I tell my, our idea with the special rapporteur of UN is to conduct a new visit the next year to follow the compliance with the recommendation of this report. David Kay, the reporter of UN, agree with this idea, and perhaps in the next months we release a public, call for the new government to allow a new visit. Of course, not 2 weeks like the last, but specifically to follow the recommendation, the main recommendation of this report. And on the other hand, I think that the civil society organization that is conduct extraordinary work that in the international level, like Reporter Without Borders and CPJ, but also in the field like Article 19, Fundar, Reporteros de a pie, and so on. I think they are in the main time to waiting to the final, way of the government, no? And then I think if the government don't have a clear response about all of these problems that currently are in course, I think that the relationship, because perhaps be changed or perhaps come more strong. I think we lost a momentum in the last 2 years because we have a lot of attention of the international organization. Also, Roberta, the U.S. ambassador, have a pressure about that. Many research that we know that was conducted through the special prosecutor and also the mechanism, and now we lost this momentum. I don't know. Perhaps if the government now clarify and relaunch and rebuilding a policy about all of these things, we could be, address another moment to change.
quick thing. I think I would comment, I think beyond environmental journalists, the biggest attacks and killings of human rights defenders in Mexico are mostly related to environmental activists and people protesting local communities, looking at mega projects and other projects in Mexico. The last defender that was killed in Tabasco was actually working to defend howler monkeys in the state, as well as looking at some perhaps illegal theft of sand, if I remember correctly. I mean, a lot of concern about criminal activity. So I think environmental defenders in particular continue to be very much at risk in Mexico and might likely continue as these larger projects move forward in the country. I think just two other quick things. I would say that, as Edison just mentioned, organizations in Mexico really worked hard to support journalists and journalists themselves. I think Periodistas de a Pie, which is the organization that Marcelo Torate, Daniel Herrera, and others established years ago, really was originally founded to look at self-care for journalists and workshops on both how do you support local journalists to even do investigative journalism, but also how do you work to protect yourselves. I think contrasting to a human rights community that has a large network, et cetera, I think the journalists now are a lot more organized, particularly at the local level or with national-based organizations than they were a few years ago, at least to look at better care for themselves, but also networking that I don't think we saw maybe a decade ago. And I think lastly, the contingency plan is kind of innovative part. It does exist in the mechanism. In this case, in Chihuahua, it was really pushed forward at the request of over, I think, 20 organizations from Chihuahua, but it's basically the federal government, so the Junta de Gobierno, which is like the governing board of the mechanism, which includes several different ministries of the Mexican government, as well as the Civil Society Participation Committee to that, and then state authorities, local activists, both human rights defenders and journalists, and then the National Human Rights Commission, as well as the High Commissioner's Office for Human Rights Mexico office, also participate. And at times there's observers from international organizations, Peace Brigades International accompanies the process in Chihuahua because they have an office there. Foreign embassies have at times sent people to observe the process. So I think it's the innovative part is it's very much a holistic approach that's not just federal government led, but also working on how do you strengthen state capacity and state commitment. But you need that commitment. So one of the challenges in the past was that the federal government would send second, third level officials to the meetings instead of the directors of different offices. And so really, I think wanting to see that, you know, if it's done well, it could be a better way to move forward on prevention. And it is where you have a more inclusive process that includes the organizations or beneficiaries themselves.
I love to say that also another actor to improve the commitment with protect to the journalists, it's the media outlets, because in this report we address that the problem that in many cases the national media don't protect well our own journalists in the field, and in the case of Mexico, that the risk is very high. It's really incredible that the national media outlet don't have a system to protect our own journalists. In fact, many cases of the desplazamientos is journalists that need to go out for their states. They lost the job because they have a risk. Entonces, it's another chapter of the situation.
Great point. We're out of time, but I want to thank you all for coming out in the hot weather to join us for what I think has been a really informative conversation. I want to just thank my colleague Tamar Ziff in the back and our colleagues Sabine and Noni and Daphne from RSF. And please just join me in thanking our great panelists.